Welcome to Libyth. If you have listened to the reading of the Taiheiki, you have spent time inside a text that moves differently from the way most narratives move. You may have felt, at various points, that the story was not quite building toward anything, that it was accumulating rather than progressing, that each episode felt complete in itself while also opening into the next without the sense of mounting inevitability that a plot normally provides. You may have finished and felt something, weight, sorrow, a kind of exhaustion that wasn't unpleasant, without being entirely able to name what you had experienced. This video is about that feeling. It is about what kind of object the Taiheiki actually is, how it is built, why it moves the way it moves, and what the shape of the whole thing means. The Taiheiki runs to 40 chapters. The English translation by Helen Craig, McCullough, covers only the first 12, which already gives you an indication of the scale of the project and the difficulty of getting inside it whole. 40 chapters across nearly 50 years of conflict is not a novel. It is not a chronicle in the administrative sense. It is something more like a mosaic, a vast, painstakingly assembled surface in which each individual piece has its own integrity and color. But the meaning of the whole only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the pattern. The problem is that stepping back that far requires holding an enormous amount in your mind simultaneously, and the Taiheiki does not help you do this. It does not provide overviews or summaries. It does not pause to reflect on what has happened. It moves forward, always forward, one battle, one council, one death, one ceremony, one ghost, one prayer at a time. The broad shape of the 40 chapters can be understood as 3 phases, though the transitions between them are gradual rather than marked. The first phase covers the fall of the Kamakura shogunate, the deterioration of Hojo power, Go-Daigo's plotting and exile, the coalescence of the forces that will eventually destroy Kamakura. The second phase covers the Kenmu Restoration, Go-Daigo's brief and ultimately failed attempt to rule directly, to actually be an emperor in the full governmental sense rather than a ceremonial one. The third phase covers the Nanboku-chō War itself, the splitting of Japan into 2 courts, the decades of conflict that the text treats as both inevitable and catastrophic. Each phase has its own logic, its own set of actors, its own emotional register. The first is about collapse. The second is about hubris, about what happens when a system that has been broken is replaced with something that turns out to be equally broken, only faster. The third is about endurance, about people sustaining commitments in the face of a conflict that refuses to end and refuses to be won. Within each phase, the Taiheiki organizes itself around episodes. Not chapters in the modern sense, not units of equal length and consistent function, but episodes in something like the ancient sense. Self-contained narrative events that carry their own beginning, middle, and end, and that can be performed or read or transmitted independently without losing their meaning, while also contributing to the larger accumulation. The death of a great warrior is an episode. The fall of a castle is an episode. A diplomatic mission that ends in betrayal is an episode. A vision or a dream that reveals the fate awaiting a ruler is an episode. The Taiheiki is extraordinarily good at these individual units. It knows how to build them, how to load them with detail and emotional weight, how to give a death scene the gravity of a whole life, how to make a single battle feel like the distillation of everything the text has been building toward. What it is less interested in, what it actually seems to resist, is the machinery that would connect all these episodes into a continuous causal argument. This is not a failure. It is a choice, and it is worth understanding what the choice implies. The Taiheiki does not explain why things happen. It shows that they happen. It shows how they happen in the immediate sense, and it often shows what happens next. But the deep causal question, why did the Kamakura shogunate fall? Why did the Kenmu Restoration fail? Why did the war last so long and produce such suffering, is not answered by any character or narrator within the text. It is implied by the structure itself, by the relentless accumulation of episodes in which every action produces consequences that no one intended and no one can control, in which every victory turns out to contain the seeds of the next defeat, in which the moral universe is legible. We know who the text admires. We know what virtues it values, but the cosmic order that should reward virtue and punish vice has gone silent. The comparison that comes to mind is the Iliad. Not because the Taiheiki is Greek, or because the warriors of 14th century Japan are in any simple way like Homeric heroes, but because both texts share a structural commitment to the episode over the arc, to the aristeia, the individual moment of warrior excellence, over the teleological plot. In the Iliad, the war will eventually end, Troy will fall, but the text itself doesn't show you that. It shows you Achilles in his rage, Hector on the walls of Troy, individual men in individual moments of supreme action and supreme suffering. The war is the frame, not the content. The content is what it means to be a warrior, what it costs, what it illuminates about the human condition. The Taiheiki works similarly. The Nanboku-chō war is the frame. The content is the individual warrior, the individual moment of choice or sacrifice or betrayal, the individual instant in which a person becomes legible to themselves and to history. But there is something in the Taiheiki that the Iliad does not have, or has differently, the Buddhist framework of impermanence. Every cycle of rise and fall in the text is not just a narrative rhythm, it is a philosophical statement. Power attracts, corrupts, overreaches, collapses. This happens to the Hojo. It happens to Godego. It will happen, the text implies, to Ashikaga Takoji. It will happen to everyone, because it is the nature of power, and the nature of power is the nature of all worldly things. Temporary, contingent, ultimately empty. The Taiheiki invokes this framework not as an abstract doctrine, but as lived experience. You read it in the specificity with which the text describes the moments of collapse, the detail given to the mass suicide at Kamakura, the care with which it records who died and how. And you feel that the text is trying to make you feel the weight of what is being lost, even as it insists that loss is inevitable. This brings us to the question of omissions, which is as important as any question about what the Taiheiki contains. The text does not give its characters interior, lives in the way a modern novel would. We are rarely told what a warrior is thinking, what he fears, what doubts he carries into battle. We are given speeches, formal, often beautiful speeches that express positions and values in elevated language. But speeches are performances, not confessions. We are given actions. We are given results. The inner life, the experience of decision from the inside, is almost entirely absent. This is partly a feature of the genre, which is not interested in psychological realism in the modern sense. But it is also, I think, a philosophical position. In a world structured by loyalty and obligation, the interior life is not the relevant unit of analysis. What matters is what you do. The Taiheiki honors men who do the right thing even when they know it will kill them. It does not ask them to explain how they arrived at that decision, because within its moral universe, there is no arriving. There is only the doing or the failing to do. The text also does not give us causes in the political analytical sense. It does not explain, as a modern historian would, the structural reasons for the Kamakura shogunate's decline. It shows the decline, registers its effects on specific men and families, and allows the reader to infer what they will. This is not because the text lacks intellectual sophistication. It is because its mode of understanding is moral rather than structural. Things happen because people choose wrongly or rightly, because fate moves, because the wheel turns. Structural explanation is not its language. This means that a reader coming to the Taiheiki from outside the tradition has to do a certain amount of interpretive work, has to supply the structural context that the text takes for granted, to see why what happens has to happen, why the choices available to the characters are the choices they are and not others. The ending, or rather the non-ending, is worth dwelling on. The text stops before the war ends. The Nanboku-chō conflict continued until 1392, decades after the Taiheiki's narrative concludes. The text simply stops, mid-conflict, without resolution. This is sometimes explained as a consequence of the text's composite and unfinished nature. Different compilers stopped at different points, and the version we have is incomplete. But I think the incompleteness is also meaningful, in the way that all structures are meaningful, including unintended ones. A text about a war that refuses to end, that goes on and on producing death and suffering, and no decisive victory for the side the text believes in. Such a text perhaps could not end. To end would be to impose a resolution that the history refused to provide. The Taiheiki leaves you in the middle of the thing. That is where the people who lived through it were left, and perhaps that is the most honest thing the text can do. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.